The day my husband realized my company had become bigger than his, I watched the color drain from his face through the glass walls of that conference
I really
room.
think the boutique could work.
30 years earlier, Michael
A
Ramos had
boutique?
laughed so
That's
hard
the
at my
funniest
business
thing I've heard
idea
all year.
that he nearly spilled his
I
wine
believe you'll
across the
find the
dinner table.
revised terms are quite clear.
"You're running a company,"
We
he
move
said.
forward on my
"That's
conditions,
adorable, Heidi."
or we don't
Back
move forward
then,
at all.
Even my own son laughed with him. But now the executives sitting around that table were waiting for me to make the final decision on a contract Michael had spent 2 years chasing. And for the first time in our marriage, my husband looked afraid of me. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you loved, I want you to tell me in the comments. I really do read them, especially late at night when the world gets quiet. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Don't forget to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to your heart. When people looked at my husband, Michael Ramos, they saw a successful man. They saw confidence, a booming voice, tailored jackets, expensive watches. The owner of Ramos Contracting Group, one of the most recognizable construction companies in Columbus, Ohio. But when I looked at Michael, I saw every invisible stitch holding that success together. And most of those stitches had my fingerprints on them. 30 years earlier, when Michael and I first got married, we had almost nothing. We lived in a tiny duplex with stained carpet and windows that rattled every winter when the Ohio wind pushed against them. Michael had one rusted pickup truck and a toolbox he guarded like treasure. Back then, he used to look at me like I was magic. "You believe in me more than I believe in myself," he told me once while we sat on the floor eating takeout because we couldn't afford a table. I believed every word he said, and maybe that was my first mistake. When Michael started his company, he didn't know how to organize invoices, calculate taxes, or write professional estimates. He was good with people and great at selling confidence, but the business itself, that part was chaos. So after finishing my bookkeeping job every afternoon, I came home and helped him for hours. I answered client emails. I corrected contracts. I balanced accounts. I stayed up until midnight fixing mistakes Michael never even noticed. And when payroll was short during the second year, I quietly emptied my personal savings account to help cover employee checks. Michael promised me we were building something together. "We're partners," he said. I carried those words in my heart for years. But somewhere along the way, partners became Michael's company. Then, eventually, Michael's success. At business dinners, people would shake his hand while I sat beside him, smiling politely like decoration. "This is my wife, Heidi," he'd say casually. "She keeps the house running, not the business." The house. Sometimes I opened my mouth to speak, especially when conversations turned toward budgeting or project management, because I actually understood those subjects better than most men at the table. But Michael always interrupted first. "Heidi worries too much," he'd laugh. Or "She likes spreadsheets more than people." Everyone would chuckle politely. And after enough years of that, you start wondering if maybe your voice really is too small to matter. Our son Jason worshipped his father. From the time he was a teenager, he followed Michael around construction sites like a shadow. He admired Michael's confidence, his authority, the way employees immediately straightened when he entered a room. Jason inherited Michael's charm too. Tall, loud, confident. The kind of man people listened to instantly. Our daughter Emily was different. Emily noticed things. She noticed when I quietly cleared dishes while everyone else kept talking at the table. She noticed when Michael dismissed me with a wave of his hand. She noticed the exhaustion in my face after spending all day helping a business nobody acknowledged I was helping build. But Emily was younger, softer then. She didn't know how to challenge her father. Honestly, neither did I. By my 50s, I had become invisible in my own life. Michael's company grew bigger every year. Bigger office, bigger contracts, bigger ego. Meanwhile, my world somehow became smaller. I stopped buying clothes I liked because Michael said they were impractical. I stopped sharing opinions because he always corrected me publicly. I stopped mentioning my old dreams because they embarrassed him, and the frightening part, I adjusted to it. That's what happens slowly in certain marriages. You don't wake up one morning shattered. You crack quietly over decades. One small dismissal at a time. One humiliation at a time. One joke at your expense at a dinner table full of people. Until eventually, you become grateful just to avoid conflict. One night, about 4 years before everything changed, Michael hosted a dinner party for clients at our house. I spent 2 days preparing for it. Cooking, cleaning, decorating, making sure every tiny detail looked perfect. At one point during dinner, one of the clients, a woman named Sandra, asked how Michael handled project scheduling so efficiently. Before Michael could answer, I smiled politely and said, "We created a color-coded tracking system years ago that helps monitor subcontractor delays before they become expensive problems." Sandra looked impressed. "That's actually brilliant," she said. Before I could say anything else, Michael laughed. "Oh, trust me," he said, waving his fork. "Heidi makes spreadsheets for everything. If she could organize the clouds, she probably would." Everyone laughed. Even Jason. I laughed too. That was the worst part. I laughed because I didn't want the room to become uncomfortable. But later that night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen staring at wine glasses in the sink, while something inside me quietly broke. Michael walked in, loosening his tie. "Great dinner tonight," he said. I nodded. Then I asked softly, "Why do you always do that?" He frowned. "Do what make me sound ridiculous." Michael sighed dramatically, like I was exhausting him. "Heidi, come on, don't start. I'm serious. You're too sensitive." That sentence. God, I think women my age have heard those 3 words enough to fill entire graveyards. You're too sensitive. Not I hurt you. Not I'm sorry. Just your pain is inconvenient to me. Michael opened the refrigerator and grabbed bottled water while I stood there silently holding a damp kitchen towel. Then he added something that stayed with me for years. "You take things personally because you don't understand business the way I do." I still remember how cold my hands felt. Not because I believed him, but because some part of me realized he truly believed himself. That was the night I began noticing everything differently. Every interruption, every dismissive laugh. Every time Michael introduced me, like I was simply part of the furniture in his successful life. And slowly, painfully, I started asking myself a question I had avoided for decades. What if Michael Ramos wasn't the only reason his company survived all those years? What if I was? That thought terrified me. Because once a woman begins seeing her own value clearly, it becomes impossible to go back to being invisible. The night I told my family I wanted to start my own company, I already knew Michael wouldn't support me, but I still wasn't prepared for the laughter. It happened on a Sunday evening in late October. The kind of cold Ohio night where the windows fog slightly from the warmth inside the house. I had spent most of the afternoon cooking pot roast mashed potatoes and homemade biscuits because Jason and Emily were both coming over for dinner. Back then, those Sunday dinners still mattered to me. I think I kept trying to hold the family together long after the cracks had already spread through everything. Michael sat at the head of the table, scrolling through emails on his phone while I carried dishes back and forth from the kitchen. Jason was talking about a new truck he wanted to buy. Emily was helping me pour sweet tea. Normal, comfortable, familiar. And for some reason, maybe because I had spent weeks thinking about it silently, I suddenly heard myself say it before fear could stop me. "I've been considering starting my own company." The table went quiet. Not dramatic quiet, just confused quiet. Michael looked up slowly from his phone. Jason blinked at me. Emily froze with the pitcher still in her hand. I forced myself to continue. "I want to start a project management consulting business for smaller contractors. A lot of them struggle with scheduling and budgeting, and Michael laughed. Not a chuckle, not surprise, a real laugh, the kind that fills a room and makes everyone else uncomfortable. Jason immediately grinned. "Oh, come on," Michael said, wiping at his eye. "You're serious?" I felt heat rise into my face. "Yes." Michael leaned back in his chair like he had just heard the funniest joke of the year. "Heidi, he said you hate stress." "That's not true. You literally get overwhelmed ordering from Cheesecake Factory menus." Jason laughed under his breath. I looked at him hoping maybe he'd stop. He didn't. Michael shook his head, still smiling. "You want to run a company now? I already understand most of the work. Understanding paperwork isn't running a business. I know that. Do you?" His tone changed slightly then. Sharper. More patronizing. Michael pointed his fork toward me. "You know how many people fail in this industry?" I swallowed hard. "Yes." "You know how competitive construction management is?" "Yes." "And you think at 58 years old, this is the moment to suddenly become a CEO. The word CEO sounded ridiculous in his mouth when attached to me, like a child pretending to be an astronaut. Emily finally spoke softly. "Dad?" But Michael kept going. "I mean, honestly, Heidi, where is this even coming from?" I stared down at my plate for a second before answering. "I just think I'm capable of more than what I've been doing." The second those words left my mouth, something shifted at the table. Michael's smile faded slightly. Jason exchanged a quick look with him. And suddenly, I realized something uncomfortable. People get very nervous when the version of you that benefits them begins changing. Michael laughed again, but this time colder. "More than what you've been doing." I nodded quietly. He leaned forward. "You mean helping build this family?" "That's not what I said. You sound ungrateful." There it was. The weapon he always used whenever I expressed unhappiness. Ungrateful. As though my entire existence should remain permanently indebted to him. Emily set her glass down carefully. "Mom didn't say that." Michael ignored her. "You've had a good life, Heidi." I almost laughed at the irony. Women my age know that phrase too. You've had a good life. Translation: you have no right to want more. Jason finally joined in fully. Mom starting a business is a huge risk. I looked at him. I know. I just don't think you realize how hard it is. That hurt more than Michael's comments, because Jason had watched me work beside his father his entire childhood. He had seen me balancing invoices at midnight, seen me answering emergency calls during vacations, seen me helping save projects when Michael panicked. But somehow in his mind, none of that counted as real work, because I was his mother. And mothers become invisible when they do too much for too long. Michael smirked slightly. Besides, he said you can barely use Excel without asking me for help. That wasn't even true. In fact, I had taught Michael how to use Excel 20 years earlier. But the men at the table laughed anyway. Even Jason. Emily looked horrified. "Dad, stop." Michael waved dismissively. "Oh, relax. We're joking." Joking. Another word people use when cruelty starts sounding ugly out loud. I smiled weakly because I could feel tears threatening behind my eyes. "I'm just saying," Michael continued, "this sounds more like retirement boredom than an actual business plan." I stood up quietly. "I'm going to clear the dishes." Emily immediately stood too. "I'll help." But I shook my head gently. "It's okay, sweetheart." I carried plates into the kitchen while their conversation resumed behind me like nothing had happened. That part hurt too. How quickly people move on after humiliating you. I stood at the sink rinsing dishes while laughter drifted from the dining room. My chest felt tight. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy. like 30 years of swallowed words sitting inside my ribs. A few minutes later, Emily came into the kitchen anyway. "Mom, I kept washing dishes." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." I smiled faintly. "You always notice everything." Emily wrapped her arms around me from behind. "I think you'd be amazing." That almost broke me completely. Because she was the only person who said it. The only one? I turned off the water and looked at her. "Do you really?" "Yes." Her eyes filled slightly. "I think Dad's scared." I almost laughed at that. "Your father isn't scared of me." Emily didn't answer right away, and somehow that silence stayed with me longer than any words. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my old laptop open in front of me. The house was dark except for the light above the stove. Michael was upstairs watching television like nothing important had happened. I stared at the screen for almost 20 minutes. My hands were trembling, not because I didn't know what to do, because I did. And I knew once I crossed that line, something inside me would never return to its old shape again. Finally, I opened a business registration website. Business name. I hesitated only briefly, then typed Ramos Project Solutions. My maiden instinct told me not to use the Ramos name, but another part of me wanted the truth attached to everything that came next. Because I had helped build that name too. I entered my information slowly. LLC registration. Consulting services. Project coordination. Operational management. Budget planning. My heart pounded harder with every page. Then finally the screen asked one last question. Submit application. I stared at it for a long moment. Upstairs, I could hear Michael laughing at something on television. That sound traveled through the house like a reminder of every year I had spent shrinking myself to make him comfortable. Then quietly, without telling anyone, I clicked submit. And in that tiny, silent moment at my kitchen table, my second life began. Starting a company at 58 feels very different than starting one at 28. At 28, people call you ambitious. At 58, they call you unrealistic. The morning after I registered Ramos Project Solutions, I woke up before sunrise with panic sitting heavily in my chest. For a few seconds, lying there in the dark beside Michael, I almost convinced myself to cancel everything. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe I was embarrassing myself. Maybe women my age weren't supposed to begin new lives. Then Michael rolled over half asleep and muttered, "Don't forget to call the insurance guy for me today. Not good morning. Not, how are you feeling? Just another task, another expectation. Another reminder that my entire existence had quietly become administrative support for someone else's dreams. And suddenly, instead of fear, I felt something colder. Determination. I slipped quietly out of bed and went downstairs before Michael woke up. That kitchen table became my office. At first it looked almost pathetic. An old silver laptop with a weak battery, a yellow legal pad, cheap pens, a secondhand printer Emily helped me order online. No investors, no employees, no office building, just me. And honestly, that first month was humiliating. I spent hours building a website nobody visited. I made business cards that sat untouched in a box near the refrigerator. I emailed contractors introducing my services and received almost no replies. Some never answered. Some politely declined. One man actually responded, "We already have project managers. Thanks." I stared at that email for 10 full minutes like it physically hurt me. Because rejection feels different when you're older. You secretly wonder if everyone else sees something impossible in you that you were foolish enough not to notice. Still, every morning after Michael left for work, I sat at that kitchen table and kept going. I researched industry software, watched tutorials, updated proposals, studied bidding failures from small construction companies, and slowly I started noticing something important. Most smaller contractors weren't failing because they lacked skill. They failed because they lacked organization, poor scheduling, weak budgeting, disorganized communication. Projects collapsed from preventable mistakes. And I understood those problems better than most people because I had spent 30 years secretly solving them for Michael. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after starting the company, I got my first real phone call. I nearly dropped my coffee reaching for the phone. "Hello, is this Heidi Ramos?" "Yes." "This is Diane Parker. I got your name from someone at Miller Supply." I sat straighter instantly. Diane owned a small renovation company outside Columbus. She sounded exhausted before the conversation even fully began. "We're trying to bid on a school remodeling project," she explained. "But honestly, my paperwork's a mess." I smiled before I could stop myself. Paperwork messes I understood. "Would you like me to take a look at it?" Diane hesitated. "I should be honest," she said carefully. "We can't afford expensive consulting." I almost laughed at the irony. Neither could I. "That's okay," I told her. "Let's just start small." Diane came to my house 2 days later, carrying 3 overstuffed folders and an expression somewhere between embarrassment and desperation. We spread everything across my dining table. Invoices, scheduling drafts, material estimates, subcontractor timelines. Within 30 minutes, I found multiple issues. "You're underestimating labor costs here," I told her gently. Diane groaned. "I knew it. And your project timeline overlaps with holiday delivery delays." Her eyes widened slightly. "No one caught that." I smiled faintly. I would have made the same mistake 20 years ago. For the next several hours, we rebuilt her proposal together piece by piece. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't realized I missed. Useful. Not invisible. Not tolerated. Useful. When Diane left that evening, she hugged me tightly at the front door. "You have no idea how much this helped." I watched her drive away, feeling lighter than I had in years. 3 weeks later, Diane called screaming into the phone. "We got the contract." I laughed so hard I started crying. Not because it was a huge project, it wasn't. But because somebody trusted me, and I had helped them succeed. That feeling became addictive. Diane started referring me to other people. Small contractors mostly. Roofing companies, local remodelers, independent builders. The kind of businesses larger consulting firms ignored. And slowly, unbelievably, my calendar started filling. Michael noticed eventually. At first, he treated it like a hobby. One evening, he walked into the kitchen while I was reviewing schedules with headphones on. "What's all this?" he asked casually. "Work." He glanced at the papers. "You still doing that consulting thing?" "Still doing." Like I was knitting scarves instead of building a company. "Yes." Michael opened the refrigerator. "You making any money yet?" "A little." How little I named the amount quietly. He smirked. "Heidi, that's not a business. That's grocery money." I kept my eyes on the laptop. "It's growing." Michael chuckled. "Sure." Then he grabbed a beer and added casually, "One lucky client doesn't make you a CEO." The old version of me would have gone silent, maybe apologized for trying, maybe shrunk smaller to avoid ridicule. But something had already started changing inside me. So instead, I looked up calmly and said, "Good thing I have more than one client now." Michael blinked, just briefly, but I saw it. That tiny flicker of surprise. Not fear yet, but awareness. For the first time, he realized this wasn't disappearing. That night, after Michael went upstairs, Emily called me. "How's business?" she asked immediately. I smiled. "I think, good." "You think?" I'm scared to say it out loud. Emily laughed softly. Mom, you know what your problem is? What you spent so many years being told you weren't impressive that now you don't know what to do when you actually are. I sat there quietly holding the phone. Because deep down, I knew she was right. The strangest part of success after a lifetime of invisibility is that you almost feel guilty for wanting it. Like happiness belongs to younger people. Like reinvention has an expiration date. But every client call made me stronger. Every solved problem reminded me who I really was beneath decades of dismissal. And the more businesses I helped, the more I started noticing something dangerous. Michael's company had weaknesses. Big ones. Scheduling gaps, communication failures, budget inconsistencies. The exact kinds of problems I had quietly spent years fixing behind the scenes. Only now, nobody was fixing them anymore. One evening, I overheard Michael yelling on the phone in his office. A subcontractor issue, delayed materials, missed deadlines, the kind of chaos I used to clean up before anyone noticed. I stood in the hallway, listening silently, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't step in to save him. Not because I wanted him to fail, but because I was finally beginning to understand something important. Michael Ramos had spent decades believing he built his company alone, and soon, he was going to find out what happened when the invisible woman behind the curtain finally walked away. The first time I noticed the signatures, I thought it was a mistake. A simple clerical error. Nothing more. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon while I was searching through old tax documents in the filing cabinet near Michael's home office. One of my newer clients needed advice about loan liability, and I was trying to find an old accountant Michael used years earlier. I remembered keeping some archived paperwork in storage boxes downstairs. At that point, my company had grown enough that I was constantly learning new things. Business structures, insurance coverage, financial risk. The more I learned, the more I realized how dangerously uninformed I had been during most of my marriage. Women in my generation were often taught to trust. Trust your husband. Trust the paperwork he hands you. Trust that he knows better. I used to think that was love. Now I wondered if it had simply been conditioning. I sat cross-legged on the basement floor, surrounded by dusty banker boxes labeled taxes, payroll, and contracts. Rain tapped softly against the small basement windows while I sorted through folders. Most of it was boring. Old invoices, expired permits, insurance renewals. Then I found a folder marked Commercial Loan Renewal 2018. I almost tossed it aside. But something made me pause. Inside were copies of financial documents tied to one of Michael's larger equipment loans from several years earlier. I skimmed through the pages absently until I saw my own name. Heidi Ramos, personal guarantor. I frowned. That wasn't unusual by itself. Married couples often signed business guarantees together. But then, I noticed something strange. The signature didn't look right. I stared at it longer. Technically, it looked like my handwriting. Almost, but not fully. The H was too narrow. The final S in Ramos curved differently. A cold feeling crept slowly into my stomach. I flipped through more pages, another signature, then another, and another. Some looked authentic, others felt off. My heart began beating harder. I sat there in silence, trying to remember signing those documents. But I couldn't, not clearly, and that frightened me. Because memory gets complicated as you age. You start second-guessing yourself. Maybe I forgot. Maybe Michael handled paperwork while I signed quickly without reading. Maybe I was imagining things. I carried the folder upstairs and spread everything across the dining table. For nearly an hour, I compared signatures from birthday cards, tax returns, and old driver's licenses. The differences were subtle. Tiny, but they existed. Enough to make my chest tighten. When Michael came home that evening, I was still sitting there, staring at the papers. He loosened his tie while walking into the kitchen. "What's all this?" I looked up carefully. "Did I sign these loan papers?" Michael barely glanced at them. "Probably. I don't remember signing them." He shrugged casually. "They're old." I watched his face closely. Some of the signatures don't look like mine. That got his attention. Only for a second. But I saw it. That tiny flash in his eyes people reveal before they rearrange their expression. Michael scoffed and tossed his keys onto the counter. "Oh my God, Heidi. I'm serious. You've signed hundreds of things over the years." "I know, but you probably forgot." His tone changed instantly. Dismissive. Annoyed. Like my concern was ridiculous. I swallowed carefully. "Did you ever sign anything for me?" Michael stared at me for a moment too long, then laughed. "Are you hearing yourself right now?" I didn't answer. He walked toward the refrigerator. "This is exactly what happens when people spend too much time online reading garbage. I'm not accusing you of anything." "Good." His voice sharpened slightly on that word, because suddenly I think he realized maybe I was. Michael grabbed bottled water and shook his head. "You're being paranoid." That word again. Paranoid. Sensitive. Emotional. Crazy. Women hear these words so often that eventually we start policing our own instincts before men even have to. I looked back down at the paperwork. "I just want to understand what I signed." Michael twisted the bottle cap aggressively. "You trusted me enough for 30 years before you started this little business." Little business? There it was again. Everything important to me reduced down until it sounded childish. "You think you know everything now because a few contractors hired you. That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" I hesitated. And honestly, that hesitation changed everything. Because for the first time in our marriage, Michael looked at me not like a wife, but like a possible threat. The room went very still. Finally, he sighed dramatically and softened his voice. Classic Michael. Whenever anger stopped working, charm arrived immediately after. "Heidi," he said tiredly, "I built this company to take care of our family." I stayed quiet. "You think banks make things simple? Half the time, paperwork gets rushed through. That doesn't explain the signatures." Michael rubbed his forehead. Jesus Christ. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. "If you're trying to create drama because you're bored, I'm not doing this tonight." Bored. As if concern about legal documents tied to my name was entertainment. He walked upstairs before I could respond, leaving me alone at the table with papers spread around me like evidence I didn't fully understand yet. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying conversations from the past. Moments I had ignored. Papers Michael rushed me through. Times he said, "Just sign here." Times I trusted him without reading carefully because I believed that's what supportive wives did. Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed quietly and walked downstairs. The house felt different suddenly. Not dangerous exactly, but unfamiliar. Like I had lived beside someone for decades without fully seeing him. I sat at the kitchen table under dim light and started organizing copies of every questionable document into a separate folder. At first, guilt ate at me. Good wives weren't supposed to investigate their husbands, but another voice inside me whispered something stronger. Good husbands don't make their wives afraid to ask questions. The next morning, Emily stopped by unexpectedly on her way to work. The second she saw my face, her expression changed. "What happened?" I tried brushing it off. "I'm fine. You look sick." I hesitated, then quietly handed her the folder. Emily sat at the table, flipping through documents slowly. The more pages she read, the more serious she became. Finally, she looked up. "Mom." My throat tightened. "What did you actually sign all of these? I don't know." Emily stared down at the paperwork again, then very softly asked, "Do you think Dad forged your signature?" Hearing someone else say it out loud made the room feel colder. "I don't know," I whispered again, and that was true. Part of me still desperately wanted another explanation, because the alternative meant the man I spent 30 years loving might have viewed me less as a partner, and more as something usable. Emily reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You need to protect yourself. Protect yourself. Not protect the marriage. Not protect Dad. Myself." That sentence stayed with me all day, and for the first time in my life, I started quietly making copies of everything. Loan agreements, insurance forms, tax records, bank correspondence. I bought a small lockbox and kept it hidden beneath winter blankets in the guest room closet. Every copy I made felt both terrifying and empowering, because deep down, I think some part of me already knew something terrible. Michael Ramos wasn't just a husband who underestimated me. He was a man who had built an empire, assuming I would never question him. And now, I finally was. Success did not arrive in my life like fireworks. It arrived quietly, one phone call at a time, one relieved client at a time, one exhausted contractor saying, "Thank God somebody finally explained this to me." That was how Ramos Project Solutions began growing. Not through flashy advertising, not through connections, through trust. The funny thing about being underestimated your entire life is that people never see you coming. By the beginning of my second year, I was managing schedules and budgets for 7 different small contractors across Ohio. 7. That number may not sound impressive to some people, but to me, it felt enormous. Because every single client represented someone choosing me, not Michael, me. And slowly, I began changing too. I started dressing differently. Not dramatically, just intentionally. Blazers instead of oversized sweaters. Gold earrings I used to think were too much. Lipstick again. I even cut my hair shorter after years of wearing it the same way, because Michael once casually mentioned he preferred women who looked natural. Natural. Another word women are often expected to disappear inside. The first time Michael noticed my haircut, he barely looked up from his phone. "Huh," he said. "You changed your hair." I smiled faintly. "I did. It's shorter." "Yes." Then silence. No compliment, no insult, just mild irritation that something had changed without his approval. And somehow, that bothered him more. Around that same time, I began hearing something strange during client meetings. "Oh, you're Heidi Ramos." At first, I thought they recognized my last name because of Michael's company. But then one contractor said, "Diane Parker told me you saved her school project." Saved. That word stayed with me, because for decades I had quietly saved projects under Michael's name while nobody even knew I existed. Now, people were attaching solutions directly to me. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from a man named Walter Brooks. His voice sounded rough and tired. "This is going to sound strange," he said, "but somebody told me you're the woman who fixes disasters." I laughed before I could stop myself. I'm not sure I'd phrase it exactly like that. "Well," he sighed, "I've got a disaster." Walter owned a mid-sized construction management company outside Cincinnati. One of his commercial renovation projects had become a scheduling nightmare. Delayed permits, missing materials, confused subcontractors, cost overruns. By the time he emailed me the files, I understood why he sounded exhausted. The project wasn't failing because people were incompetent. It was failing because nobody was coordinating properly. I spent 2 full days reviewing everything. Then I drove to Cincinnati myself. Walter met me at the site, wearing muddy boots and frustration all over his face. He looked older than Michael. Broad shoulders, gray beard. The kind of man who spent his entire life working with his hands. He shook my hand firmly. "I'll be honest," he said immediately. "I wasn't expecting—" He stopped himself. "A woman my age?" I finished gently. Walter looked embarrassed. "Well, yeah." I smiled. I get that a lot. To his credit, Walter didn't double down or try to pretend otherwise. Instead, he handed me a hard hat and said, "All right then. Show me what I'm missing." That sentence changed everything. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was respectful. For the next 6 hours, I walked the site with Walter, reviewing timelines, subcontractor coordination, and delivery schedules. At one point, I noticed 2 crews scheduled for overlapping access to the same area 3 days later. "That's your bottleneck?" I said. Walter frowned at the plans. "I don't see it." I pointed carefully. "Electrical can't start before plumbing inspection clears, but drywall is scheduled immediately after electrical." Walter stared silently for several seconds, then slowly muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." By the end of the day, we had rebuilt nearly the entire project timeline. Walter drove me back to my car in silence. Finally, before I got out, he looked at me seriously. "You know something? What I've worked construction for 35 years?" I smiled politely. "And you understand project flow better than half the men I know." I looked down briefly because even then, compliments still felt unfamiliar. Walter shook his head. "No, I mean it. You see problems before they happen." I laughed softly. "That usually comes from spending decades cleaning up other people's messes." Walter stared at me for a second longer than expected, like maybe he understood exactly what I meant. A week later, he called me again. "We finished the correction plan," he said. "Client's staying on board." "That's wonderful." "No," Walter replied firmly. "You're wonderful." I sat there speechless, because some women spend so many years emotionally starving that simple respect feels overwhelming. Then Walter added, "I'd like to keep working with you long term." That partnership changed my company permanently. Walter referred me to larger projects, better clients, more serious opportunities, and with every new contract, my confidence grew stronger. Meanwhile, something else was happening too. Michael's company started struggling. At first it showed up in tiny ways: more late-night calls, more yelling in his office, more complaints about employees. One evening, he stormed into the kitchen furious because a subcontractor had missed a deadline. "This industry's full of idiots now," he snapped. I stayed quiet while stirring soup on the stove. Michael paced angrily. Nobody knows how to manage schedules anymore. The irony almost made me dizzy. For years, I had quietly managed those schedules behind the scenes. Now that I wasn't helping him, the cracks were beginning to show. A few days later, I attended a local contractor networking breakfast. Nothing fancy, just coffee eggs and business owners exchanging cards. As I walked inside, I heard someone say, "There's Heidi Ramos, not Michael's wife. Heidi Ramos." I turned and smiled politely at a group of contractors near the buffet table. One of them, a younger man named Caleb, walked over immediately. "My uncle worked with Diane Parker," he said. "He told me you saved her budget projections." There was that word again. Saved. Another contractor joined the conversation, then another. Before I realized it, 4 people were asking me questions about project coordination systems. And suddenly, I noticed something strange across the room. Michael. He stood near the coffee station talking with 2 developers, but his attention kept drifting toward me. Watching, studying, trying to understand why people suddenly cared what I had to say. When our eyes met, His expression shifted almost instantly back into casual confidence. But I caught it. That tiny flicker. Confusion. Because for the first time in our marriage, Michael was witnessing something unfamiliar. People respecting me independently of him. Later that night, he brought it up while loosening his tie in our bedroom. "You seemed popular this morning." His tone sounded light. Too light. I kept folding laundry calmly. I had a few good conversations. Michael nodded slowly. "Walter Brooks was talking to you a while?" "Yes. He's got decent contracts." I glanced at him briefly. "He's a good man." Michael sat on the edge of the bed. "So what exactly are you doing for him?" There it was. Not curiosity, calculation. I explained the basics carefully. Project coordination, budget oversight, timeline management. Michael listened quietly. Too quietly. Finally, he scoffed lightly. "Sounds like a lot of stress for small money." I smiled faintly. Maybe. But something inside me already knew the truth. This was no longer a hobby Michael could laugh away at the dinner table. This was becoming real. And deep down, I think Michael was starting to realize that too. The night Michael humiliated me at the networking gala was the same night my life changed forever. At the time, I didn't know that yet. I only knew my feet hurt, my smile felt exhausted, and I wished I had stayed home. The event was held at the Grand Monarch Hotel in downtown Columbus, one of those places with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and valet attendants who looked more expensive than most people's cars. Michael loved events like that. Rooms full of powerful men, developers, investors, contractors, people who measured worth by confidence and volume. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror before we left that evening, adjusting the sleeves of my navy blue dress. "You look beautiful," Mom Emily said softly from the doorway. I smiled faintly. "You think so?" "Yes." I looked at my reflection carefully. For years I had dressed to avoid attention. Neutral colors, simple styles, nothing too bold. But recently, Emily had started helping me choose clothes that actually made me feel visible again. The dress fit well. The earrings sparkled softly beneath the bathroom light. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel old. I felt present. Michael walked past the doorway, glanced inside, and paused. "You're dressed up." I waited. That old reflex still lived inside me, waiting for approval. But Michael only adjusted his cufflinks and said, "Don't stay too long talking to people tonight. Most of these conversations are serious business." Then he walked away. Emily stared after him in disbelief. I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, because sometimes disappointment becomes so familiar, it stops surprising you. The ballroom buzzed with conversation when we arrived. Men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses. Servers carrying champagne trays through clusters of wealthy people pretending not to compete with one another. Michael transformed instantly in rooms like that. Louder voice, straighter posture, bigger smile. He thrived on attention the way some people thrive on oxygen. Within minutes, he was shaking hands and laughing with developers near the center of the ballroom. I followed beside him like I always had. The supportive wife, the accessory. At one point, we stopped beside a group of contractors Michael knew from past projects. "This is my wife Heidi," he said casually. One of the men smiled politely. "Oh, right. I think I've heard your name recently." Michael chuckled immediately. "Well, apparently she's a businesswoman now, too." The group laughed lightly. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Another man asked politely, "What kind of business?" Before I could answer, Michael smirked. "She's got this little consulting thing going." Little consulting thing? Not company, not business, not work. A little thing. I forced a smile. I help smaller contractors with project coordination and budget planning. One of the developers raised his eyebrows. That's actually a growing market. I opened my mouth to respond, but Michael interrupted again. Oh, trust me, he laughed. Heidi loves spreadsheets more than human beings. The men laughed harder this time. One even slapped Michael on the shoulder. And suddenly, I felt 30 years old again. Small, dismissed, embarrassed for daring to exist publicly beside my husband. Michael continued grinning. She's adorable about it, though. Thinks she's gonna conquer the construction industry at 58. More laughter. I noticed one woman nearby glance at me sympathetically before quickly looking away. That hurt too. Pity. I smiled tightly and reached for a champagne glass just to have something to hold. Then a calm voice beside me said, I don't think there's anything adorable about surviving in this industry. The conversation stopped instantly. I turned. A tall woman with silver blonde hair stood beside us holding a wine glass. Elegant, composed, sharp eyes. I recognized her immediately. Victoria Bennett, one of the most respected development executives in the Midwest. Even Michael straightened slightly. Victoria, he said quickly, forcing a bigger smile. Good to see you. Victoria barely looked at him. Instead, she extended her hand toward me. Heidi Ramos. I shook her hand carefully. Yes. Victoria smiled. I've heard very impressive things about you. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Michael blinked. I'm sorry, he asked lightly. Victoria turned toward him politely. Diane Parker spoke very highly of Heidi's work. So did Walter Brooks. Michael's smile tightened. Really? Oh yes, Victoria continued calmly. Apparently your wife has a remarkable talent for saving projects before they collapse. Nobody laughed now. Not one person. And suddenly, the entire energy around us shifted. Because powerful people often decide how rooms behave. Victoria looked directly at me. I'd actually love to speak with you sometime. I struggled to answer normally. Of course. She handed me a business card. Call my office next week. Then with one final polite nod, she walked away. The moment she disappeared into the crowd, Michael let out a short laugh. Well, he said, that was unexpected. I slipped Victoria's card carefully into my purse. One of the contractors muttered awkwardly. Sounds like you've been busy, Heidi. Before I could answer, Michael clapped him on the shoulder. Don't encourage her too much. I still need my wife at home occasionally. More uncomfortable laughter. But this time, something had changed. People weren't laughing because Michael was funny anymore. They were laughing because they didn't know what else to do. And Michael knew it. The rest of the evening felt strange. Different. I noticed people approaching me independently now. Asking questions. Mentioning projects. Requesting cards. Meanwhile, Michael drank more than usual. By the time we got into the car afterward, tension filled the silence between us. Michael loosened his tie aggressively while staring out the windshield. So he said, Finally looks like you're becoming popular. I buckled my seatbelt quietly. I guess people talk. Michael started the engine. You know Victoria Bennett's reputation? Yes. She doesn't meet with small people unless there's money involved. Small people. Interesting choice of words. I looked out the passenger window. She asked to meet with me. Michael laughed softly. Probably because Walter mentioned you. Maybe. He glanced at me briefly. Don't get ahead of yourself, Heidi. That sentence irritated me more than usual. Maybe because for the first time I realized how desperately Michael needed me to remain small. As we drove home through downtown lights, he suddenly added, People in this industry can smell insecurity? I frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means if you start acting like you belong in rooms you're not ready for, They'll tear you apart. There it was again. Fear disguised as advice. I stayed quiet the rest of the drive. But later that night, after Michael fell asleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Victoria's words in my mind. Remarkable talent. Saving projects. Impressive things. Nobody had ever spoken about me that way before. Not publicly, not professionally. Certainly not in front of Michael. And deep down, I think my husband understood something terrifying that night. Other people were beginning to see value in me that he had spent decades trying to minimize. The next morning, while drinking coffee alone in the kitchen, I stared at Victoria's business card for a long time. Then finally, I turned it over. On the back, written in blue ink, was a handwritten note. "You're much more capable than your husband wants you to believe." I sat there frozen, because sometimes a stranger sees your life more clearly in 5 minutes than the people closest to you ever do. And for the first time, I started wondering just how far I could actually go if I stopped listening to Michael Ramos. I must have read Victoria Bennett's handwritten note at least 20 times. "You're much more capable than your husband wants you to believe." I kept turning the business card over in my hands like the words might disappear if I looked away too long. For days afterward, I carried it inside my purse everywhere I went. Not because I needed motivation, because I needed proof. Proof that maybe I hadn't imagined everything. Proof that my instincts weren't foolish. Proof that the smaller version of myself Michael preferred wasn't the only version that existed. The following Tuesday morning, I finally gathered enough courage to call Victoria's office. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly hung up before the receptionist answered. "Bennett Development Group." "Hi," I said softly. "This is Heidi Ramos. Victoria asked me to contact her." There was a brief pause. "Then one moment, please, Miss Ramos." "Miss Ramos. Not Michael's wife. Not Heidi. Ms. Ramos." I sat straighter in my chair without even realizing it. A few seconds later, Victoria herself came on the line. "Heidi," she said warmly, "I was hoping you'd call." That sentence alone nearly made me emotional. Because women who spend years being dismissed become startled by simple enthusiasm. Victoria invited me to lunch at a restaurant downtown 2 days later. I barely slept the night before, not because I was unprepared, because I was terrified of being exposed as someone pretending to belong in rooms like that. The restaurant overlooked the Scioto River, all polished wood and floor-to-ceiling windows. Everyone inside looked expensive. I arrived 15 minutes early. Classic anxiety. Victoria arrived exactly on time. She wore a cream-colored blazer and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone long accustomed to power. But what struck me most was how directly she looked at people. Like they mattered. Like she expected them to take up space. After we ordered, Victoria got straight to the point. "I've reviewed several projects you worked on." I blinked. "You did Walter Brooks' shared files with your permission." I nodded slowly. Victoria leaned back slightly. "You're very good." There it was again. Simple words, but they landed somewhere deep inside me. "Thank you. You understand operational flow better than many consultants charging triple your rates." I laughed nervously. "I think I just spent a long time fixing problems." Victoria smiled knowingly. "That's usually where expertise comes from." Then her expression shifted slightly more serious. "Heidi, do you know why small contractors trust you?" I shook my head. "Because you actually listen to them." Nobody had ever described my work that way before. Victoria continued. "Most consulting firms talk down to smaller businesses. You don't." I looked down briefly at my coffee cup. I know what it feels like to be dismissed. Victoria studied me carefully for a moment, then quietly asked, "Does your husband know how talented you are?" The question caught me off guard. I gave a small laugh. I don't think Michael really sees me that way. Victoria's eyes sharpened slightly. No? She said softly. I imagine he doesn't. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her briefcase and slid a folder across the table toward me. I frowned. What's this proposal? My stomach tightened instantly. Victoria explained that Bennett Development Group was preparing a large community housing project outside Cleveland. Affordable housing. Multiple contractors. Complex scheduling. Tight budgets. The kind of project where operational mistakes could destroy millions. We need someone overseeing coordination between subcontractors and development teams, Victoria said. I stared at her in disbelief. You want me? I do. My heart pounded harder. This project is enormous. Yes, I've never managed anything that large. Victoria folded her hands calmly. Heidi, you've been managing large operations your entire life. Not officially. That doesn't mean you weren't doing it. I looked out the window briefly, because suddenly emotion clogged my throat unexpectedly. For 30 years, my labor had existed in shadows, invisible work, uncredited work people benefited from while pretending it wasn't real. And now this woman sitting across from me was speaking about my experience as though it mattered. As though I mattered. I'm scared, I admitted quietly. Victoria nodded immediately. Good. I frowned slightly. That's good. The people who scare me are the ones who aren't afraid. I laughed softly. Then Victoria leaned forward. Heidi, let me tell you something important. I looked at her. Men apply for jobs they're underqualified for every single day and call it confidence. I smiled despite myself. But women, she continued, wait until they've already been doing the work for 20 years before believing they deserve the title. God, that hit me hard. Because it was true. I had spent decades performing executive-level work while still thinking of myself as just helping. Victoria handed me the formal proposal. Take a few days if you need to. But honestly, I already knew my answer before lunch ended. When I got home that afternoon, Michael was in his office yelling into the phone again. Something about delayed permits, missed deadlines, cost overruns. His company seemed increasingly tense lately. Employees called more often. Clients sounded frustrated. And the strangest part, Michael looked tired. Older somehow, as if the pressure he used to hand off quietly onto me had nowhere else to go anymore. He walked into the kitchen while I was pouring coffee. You were out a while. I had lunch. With who? Victoria Bennett. That got his full attention immediately. Michael frowned. What for? I hesitated only briefly. She offered me a consulting position on a development project. Michael laughed automatically, but it sounded forced this time. What kind of project? I explained carefully. The more details I gave, the more serious his face became. Finally, he scoffed. That's way too big for you. There was no hesitation in his voice, no encouragement, no pride, just immediate rejection. I set my coffee cup down slowly. Maybe. Michael crossed his arms. Heidi, these developers eat people alive? I know. You don't have experience with that scale. I stayed quiet. Michael sighed dramatically. I'm trying to protect you from embarrassing yourself. Protect. Interesting word, because suddenly his protection felt very similar to control. That night, Emily came over after work, and I told her everything while we sat in the kitchen. Her eyes widened. Mom, this is huge. I know. You're taking it right. I hesitated. Emily stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Why are you hesitating? What if your father's right? Emily looked genuinely sad hearing that. Mom. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. You know what's heartbreaking? What you still think Dad's opinion is the same thing as reality. That sentence sat heavily between us. because deep down, I knew she was right too. Later that evening, Walter Brooks called unexpectedly. Victoria had apparently spoken with him already. "You better take that contract," he said immediately. I laughed nervously. "You don't think it's too much?" Walter snorted. "Heidi, I've watched multi-million-dollar projects held together by men half as competent as you." I smiled, despite myself. Then Walter added something that stayed with me forever. "You've spent your whole life carrying responsibilities bigger than your title." Silence filled the phone line for a second, because that was exactly it. That was my entire marriage. Finally, I whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready." Walter's answer came instantly. "You're never going to feel ready for the life you actually deserve." That night, I stood alone in my kitchen long after everyone else went to bed. The same kitchen where Michael once laughed at my company. The same kitchen where I quietly built it anyway. And somewhere between fear and exhaustion and hope, I finally realized something. The world outside my marriage was beginning to see me clearly. The only question left was whether I could learn to see myself that way too. The first real crack in Michael's company appeared 3 months after I accepted Victoria Bennett's project. Not publicly, not dramatically, just a quiet little fracture beneath the surface. But anyone who has lived long enough knows something important about cracks. They spread. At first, Michael blamed everyone except himself. Employees were lazy, suppliers were incompetent, subcontractors were unreliable. According to Michael, the entire construction industry had suddenly become filled with idiots. But I knew better, because I recognized the exact problems happening inside Ramos Contracting Group. I had spent 30 years secretly preventing them. Now, nobody was. By then, my own company barely resembled the little side business Michael once mocked at the dinner table. Ramos Project Solutions had moved into a small office space near downtown Columbus. Nothing extravagant, just 3 offices, a conference room, and a receptionist area with gray carpet and terrible coffee. But to me, it felt like a palace. The first morning I unlocked the office door alone, I stood there silently for nearly a full minute, staring at the company name on the glass. Heidi Ramos, founder and CEO. I still wasn't fully used to seeing those words together. Emily had started helping part-time with client communication and scheduling. Watching my daughter sit across from me in meetings felt surreal somehow, like we were healing something together. One afternoon after a project call, Emily leaned back in her chair, smiling. "You know you sound different now, right?" I looked up from my laptop. "What do you mean, confident?" I laughed softly. I fake it pretty well. "No," Emily said seriously. "I think maybe this is who you were before everyone convinced you to shrink." Her words stayed with me all evening, because slowly, painfully, I was beginning to realize confidence isn't something people give you. It's something they stop taking away from you. Meanwhile, Michael's company continued slipping. The problems were everywhere now. Missed scheduling deadlines, overlapping subcontractor crews, budget overruns, communication failures between field supervisors. The exact operational issues I had quietly managed behind the scenes for decades. One night, Michael came home furious after losing a regional commercial bid. He slammed his keys onto the kitchen counter hard enough to startle me. "This whole industry's become political garbage," he snapped. I stayed calm while organizing files at the dining table. "What happened? What happened?" Michael scoffed. "Some idiot developer picked another contractor because they claimed we had coordination concerns." Coordination concerns. I lowered my eyes to hide my reaction. Michael paced the kitchen aggressively. 30 years in business, and suddenly people think they know better than me. Then he stopped walking and looked directly at me. You know what's funny? I stayed quiet. These people suddenly care about management systems now. Scheduling oversight, operational transparency. Every word sounded almost personal. Because it was. The industry was changing. Developers no longer wanted loud men who relied entirely on charisma and intimidation. They wanted structure, organization, accountability. Everything Michael used to mock me for valuing. And now those same qualities were becoming essential. Michael opened the refrigerator and grabbed a beer. You know who's behind this shift, he muttered bitterly. Who consultants? The way he said the word sounded almost dirty. I didn't respond. Michael took a long drink. People who've never swung a hammer suddenly think they run construction. That sentence irritated me more than it should have. Because for decades, Michael had benefited from my expertise while pretending expertise only mattered if it came from a man holding blueprints on a construction site. I closed my laptop slowly. Management matters too, Michael. He laughed harshly. Management supports the real work. I stared at him. And what exactly is the real work? Michael looked genuinely confused by the question. The building. I nodded slowly. And how many buildings get completed properly without schedules, budgets, permits, inspections, labor coordination, supplier communication, and financial tracking? Michael opened his mouth, then closed it. For a second, real tension filled the room, because suddenly, I wasn't quietly absorbing his opinions anymore. I was challenging them. Michael's expression hardened slightly. You've changed. The words weren't admiration. They were accusation. Yes, I said softly. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than if I had argued. Later that week, Jason came by unexpectedly. He still visited Michael constantly for business advice and construction discussions. They had become more alike over the years than either of them realized. Jason walked into the kitchen while I was reviewing project files. You're always working now? He joked lightly. I smiled faintly. So are you. He sat down across from me. How's the little company? Still? Even now? I kept my voice calm. It's growing. Jason nodded casually. Dad says you landed some decent contracts. I looked at him carefully. Your father talks about my business sometimes. That surprised me more than it should have. Jason leaned back in the chair. He thinks you're taking on too much. I almost laughed. Of course, Michael framed concern as wisdom. He worried when he started his company too, Jason continued. I stared at my son quietly. The heartbreaking thing about generational behavior is how naturally children inherit perspectives without questioning them. Jason genuinely believed his father was the brave entrepreneur, and I was the reckless beginner. He never saw the invisible labor beneath Michael's success, because the world rarely teaches sons to notice women quietly holding things together. Jason, I asked softly, do you think your father built his company alone? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I asked. Jason shifted awkwardly. Well, obviously you supported him. Supported. Such a small word for decades of unpaid executive-level labor. I nodded slowly, and if I hadn't, Jason hesitated, then shrugged. Dad probably still would have figured it out. That answer hurt more than I expected. Not because he intended cruelty, because he truly believed it. I looked down at the paperwork in front of me to steady myself. Meanwhile, upstairs, Michael shouted angrily into another phone call. Jason glanced toward the ceiling. Things have been stressful lately. For your father? Yeah, some projects are behind schedule. I said nothing. Jason rubbed the back of his neck. He's under a lot of pressure. And suddenly, I realized something devastating. Even now, even after all the humiliation, even after years of invisibility. My first instinct was still sympathy, because women like me are trained to emotionally caretaking men who would never do the same for us. That night after Jason left, I stayed late at the office reviewing development schedules for Victoria's housing project. The project was growing quickly. Bigger budgets, more contractors, more responsibility. And strangely enough, I was thriving. Not perfectly, not fearlessly, but genuinely thriving. At nearly midnight, Walter Brooks stopped by my office unexpectedly after finishing a site inspection nearby. He glanced around the office, smiling. "Look at this place." I laughed tiredly. "It still smells like fresh paint." Walter sat across from me. "You know people are talking about your company now." My stomach tightened slightly. In a bad way, in an impressed way. That felt unfamiliar enough to make me uncomfortable. Walter leaned back in the chair. "Michael's not handling it well." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Walter hesitated briefly. "He thinks you're competing against him." I stared silently at the spreadsheets in front of me. Because deep down, maybe I finally was. Not intentionally, not maliciously. But every contract I earned forced people to compare us. And for the first time in our marriage, Michael Ramos was no longer automatically winning. The first time Michael deliberately tried to sabotage my company, I think part of me still wanted to believe it was an accident. That's the dangerous thing about loving someone for 30 years. Even when the truth stands directly in front of you, your heart keeps searching for kinder explanations. At that point, Ramos Project Solutions had grown faster than I ever imagined possible. Victoria Bennett's housing development project opened doors I didn't even know existed. Developers started requesting meetings. Contractors referred clients. My office hired 2 new coordinators and a financial assistant within 4 months. Some mornings, I walked into work feeling like I was living inside someone else's life. Not because I felt undeserving anymore, because I still wasn't fully used to being respected. But success changes the atmosphere around you. People who ignored you suddenly remember your name. People who mocked you suddenly become cautious. And people who benefited from your silence, they often become angry when you finally find your voice. The trouble started with a project in Dayton, a commercial redevelopment contract worth more money than any consulting agreement I had ever handled. If we landed it, Ramos Project Solutions would officially move into a completely different level of business. I worked on the proposal for nearly 3 weeks. Late nights, detailed timelines, risk analysis, subcontractor coordination structures. Walter Brooks even helped review some operational details before submission. "It's solid," he told me confidently. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel proud before something was officially finished. That was probably my mistake. 3 days before the final presentation meeting, I received an unexpected phone call from the client representative. His tone sounded strangely hesitant. "Ms. Ramos," he said carefully, "there have been concerns raised." My stomach tightened immediately. "What kind of concerns?" A pause. "Questions about whether your company has enough experience handling large-scale commercial coordination?" I frowned. "We already provided our project history." "Yes, but someone suggested much of your experience came indirectly through your husband's company?" The room went cold around me. I gripped the phone tighter. "Who suggested that?" Another pause. I'd rather not say. But I already knew. Deep down, I knew instantly. Michael. The client continued carefully. "There were also concerns mentioned about your staffing capabilities." I stared silently at the office wall. Not because I was shocked, because I was heartbroken. Even after everything, even after all the years I spent helping him succeed. Michael still couldn't tolerate the possibility of me succeeding independently. When the call ended, I sat motionless at my desk for several minutes. Then quietly, I closed my office door and cried. Not loud, not dramatic. Just exhausted tears from a woman finally realizing the man she loved viewed her growth as betrayal. A soft knock interrupted me. Emily peeked inside carefully. "Mom," I wiped my face quickly. "I'm okay." Emily immediately crossed the room. "What happened?" I explained the phone call slowly. The more she listened, the angrier she became. "Oh my God." I shook my head weakly. "Maybe it wasn't your father?" Emily looked at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Mom, I just know." Her voice sharpened harder than usual. "You have to stop protecting him." That sentence hit me hard, because she was right. Even now, I still instinctively softened Michael's behavior to make it easier to survive emotionally. Emily sat across from me furious. "He's threatened by you. I don't want this family destroyed." Emily's eyes filled slightly. "Mom, this family was already hurting long before you started your company." God, sometimes truth sounds unbearable simply because it arrives too late. That evening, I confronted Michael for the first time in our marriage without softening my voice to protect his feelings. He sat in the living room watching financial news when I walked in, holding the Dayton proposal folder. "We need to talk." Michael barely glanced up. "About what?" "Did you contact the Dayton developers?" That got his attention instantly. He muted the television slowly. "What are you talking about?" "They received calls questioning my qualifications." Michael stared at me for a moment, then leaned back casually. I may have mentioned concerns. The calmness of his answer shocked me more than denial would have. "You sabotaged me?" Michael scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." I felt my heartbeat pounding in my throat. "You intentionally tried to damage my company. I tried protecting people from making bad decisions." I stared at him in disbelief. "You don't think I can do this?" Michael laughed softly. "Heidi running a few small projects is one thing. My company isn't small anymore." The words came out before I could stop them, and instantly the room changed. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was, the real issue. Not the project, not qualifications. Power. For decades, Michael held all of it inside our marriage. Now he could feel it shifting. "You've changed since you started making money," he said coldly. "No," I answered quietly. "I've changed since I realized I mattered." That silence afterward felt enormous. Michael stood slowly. "You know what your problem is?" I crossed my arms. "You." He ignored that. "People gave you a little attention, and now you think you're some kind of executive." The cruelty in his voice no longer even sounded accidental. "You spent 30 years treating me like I was invisible?" I whispered. Michael laughed bitterly. "Because you were never built for this world." That sentence sliced through me. Not because I believed him anymore, because I finally realized how long he had needed me to. We stood there staring at each other like strangers wearing familiar faces. Then Michael said something that changed everything between us permanently. "You're only getting these opportunities because of my name. My name. Not ours. His." I looked at him carefully. "You really believe that I know it?" I nodded slowly. Then for the first time in 30 years, I said the words I should have spoken long ago. "You needed me far more than you ever admitted." Michael's expression hardened instantly. "That's ridiculous. Who managed payroll crises? That's bookkeeping. Who reorganized schedules after subcontractor failures? You helped. Who kept clients from walking away during budget overruns?" Michael's jaw tightened. I stepped closer. "Who spent decades cleaning up your mistakes while you took all the credit?" The room fell completely silent, because deep down, Michael knew the answers too. That night, he slept in the guest room for the first time in our marriage. And somehow, the house felt quieter than it had in years. But the worst pain came 2 days later. Jason stopped by my office unexpectedly. His face looked tense. "Mom," he said carefully. "Dad told me what happened. I already knew whose side he would take before he spoke." Jason sighed heavily. "You shouldn't be competing against him like this." That sentence hurt so badly I almost laughed. Competing. As if my existence itself had become aggression. "I'm building my own business, using the Ramos name. I earned that name too." Jason shook his head. "Dad built everything first. There it was again. The mythology of self-made men built on invisible women's labor." I looked at my son quietly. "Do you really think your father did everything alone?" Jason rubbed his forehead. "I just think this whole thing is getting ugly." I nodded slowly, because for the first time, I finally understood something heartbreaking. Jason didn't see me clearly. Not yet. To him, I was disrupting the family structure he grew up worshiping. And Michael was no longer just threatened by my success. He was terrified of losing control over the narrative that had defined our entire marriage. The narrative where he was the builder, and I was simply the woman standing quietly beside him. The commercial redevelopment project in Dayton became the most important contract either Michael or I had pursued in years, and everyone in the industry knew it. The project would transform nearly 6 abandoned city blocks into restaurants, office space, retail storefronts, and residential apartments. Whoever secured the primary operational contract would instantly gain credibility across the Midwest. For Michael, it was survival. For me, it was proof. Not proof for the industry anymore. Proof for myself. By then, Ramos Project Solutions had grown beyond anything I once imagined possible at my kitchen table. We had 9 employees, 3 active development projects, a waiting list of contractors requesting consultations. Some mornings, I walked through my office hearing phones ringing, employees discussing timelines, printers running nonstop. And I still had moments where I quietly thought, this cannot possibly be my life. But success came with pressure too. The closer we got to the Dayton final selection meeting, the more tense everything became. Michael stopped speaking to me except when absolutely necessary. At home, we moved around each other like people trapped inside a long funeral. Cold politeness, minimal conversation, separate meals, separate lives. Only Emily still visited regularly. Jason had become distant after our argument. Not cruel, exactly. Just loyal to the version of the family he didn't want to admit was collapsing. One evening, Emily stayed late at my office helping organize proposal binders for Dayton. She glanced toward me while stapling documents. "You nervous?" I laughed softly, terrified. Emily smiled. "Good. That's what Victoria said too." Emily leaned back in her chair. "You know what's weird? What you're happier now than I've ever seen you?" That sentence stunned me a little, because happiness wasn't exactly how I would have described myself lately. Exhausted? Yes. Stressed, definitely. But happier? Maybe. Maybe because for the first time in decades, my life actually belonged to me. A few days before the final presentation, Walter Brooks came by the office carrying coffee for everyone. My staff adored him. Walter treated every employee with kindness, regardless of position, which made him rare in construction. He stepped into my office after greeting everyone. "You ready for Dayton?" I rubbed my temples tiredly. "I think so." Walter handed me coffee. "You already know more than half the people competing for that contract." "That's not the same thing as winning it." Walter sat across from me. Heidi listened carefully. I looked up. "The reason people trust you isn't because you talk the loudest." I smiled faintly. "That's good, because I definitely don't." Walter grinned. People trust you because you make them feel safe. That word settled deeply inside me. Safe. He continued. You solve problems without making everybody feel stupid. That matters more than you realize. Before I could respond, my office phone rang. My assistant answered outside. Then a moment later, knocked carefully. Heidi, yes. There's a reporter online too asking about Ramos Contracting Group. Walter frowned immediately. I picked up the call cautiously. This is Heidi Ramos. The reporter sounded polite, but eager. Ms. Ramos, we're hearing rumors about financial concerns connected to Ramos Contracting and possible project instability. Since your companies are connected through family. My stomach tightened. I have no comment. After hanging up, I stared silently at the desk. Walter's expression darkened. What's going on with Michael? I don't know everything yet. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the past several months, Michael's behavior had become increasingly erratic. More drinking, more anger, more secrecy. And now rumors were starting. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Because, despite everything, some part of me still loved the man he used to be. Or maybe the man I thought he was? That evening, when I arrived home, Michael was sitting alone in the dark living room, holding a glass of whiskey. No television, no music, just silence. I paused near the doorway. Are you okay? Michael laughed softly without looking at me. That's funny coming from you. I sighed tiredly. I heard about the rumors. Michael took another drink. People love gossip. I stepped closer carefully. Michael, what's happening? For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, cash flow problems. The words shocked me less than his honesty. How bad Michael rubbed his forehead. Bad enough. I sat down slowly across from him. For the first time in months, he looked less angry than exhausted. Older, too. Like the pressure was finally crushing him. What happened? I asked quietly. Michael stared into his whiskey glass. Projects fell behind. I stayed silent. Suppliers raised costs. Still silent. 2 developers delayed payments. Then finally he looked directly at me. And maybe I depended on certain people more than I realized. The words hung heavily between us. Not an apology, but close enough that it hurt. I swallowed carefully. You could have treated me differently. Michael's jaw tightened. I did what I thought I had to do. To feel important. That landed harder than I expected. Michael looked away. The room felt unbearably sad suddenly. Not dramatic, just full of 30 years neither of us knew how to fix. Then Michael asked quietly, Are you really going to take Dayton from me? I stared at him in disbelief. Take it from him. Even now he still viewed my success as theft instead of independent achievement. I earned my place there. Michael gave a bitter smile. You wouldn't even be in those rooms without me. That tiny moment of vulnerability vanished instantly. And suddenly, I saw the truth clearly. Michael would rather destroy our marriage than admit I had value separate from him. The next morning, the final proposal presentations began. The developers rented a large conference center downtown for the meetings. Construction executives filled the building. Developers, financial backers, city representatives, everyone dressed sharply and pretending not to panic. Ramos Project Solutions presented third. I stood outside the conference room beforehand, trying to steady my breathing. My hands shook slightly holding the proposal binder. Then I heard Michael's voice behind me. You look nervous. I turned slowly. He wore a charcoal suit and forced confidence like armor. I am nervous, I admitted. Michael smirked faintly. At least you're self-aware. The old version of me would have shrunk under that comment. But now, I simply nodded. And you look tired. Something flickered across his face briefly. Because he was tired, exhausted, worn thin from trying to maintain control over a life already slipping away. Before he could answer, the conference room doors opened. Our team entered together. And for the first time in our entire marriage, Michael and I walked into the same room not as husband and wife, but as competitors. The presentation lasted nearly 90 minutes. Questions about budgets, scheduling systems, contractor accountability, risk management. And strangely enough, once I started speaking, the fear disappeared. Because this world no longer felt foreign to me. I knew these systems. I understood these problems. I belonged here. At one point, a developer asked how our company handled project disruption during supply shortages. I answered calmly, clearly, confidently. Across the table, I noticed Michael watching me instead of the panel. Not proudly, not lovingly, almost uneasily. Like he was finally seeing me fully for the first time. And realizing too late that the woman he mocked at the dinner table had quietly become someone powerful enough to stand beside him, or even surpass him. After the Dayton presentation, everyone expected a war between Michael and me. Honestly, part of me expected one too. Construction executives gossip worse than church ladies in small towns. By the end of that week, half the industry seemed aware that Michael Ramos and his wife were competing for the same multi-million-dollar project. And people loved it. I overheard whispers at networking events. Can you imagine going against your own husband? I heard she's actually outperforming him. Michael's furious. The truth was more complicated. Michael wasn't furious all the time anymore. Sometimes he just looked scared. That was harder to watch. 3 days after the presentation, Victoria Bennett called me into her office. The moment I arrived, I could feel tension in the building. Assistants moving quickly, developers whispering in hallways. Something was happening. Victoria closed the office door behind me. We've run into an issue. My stomach tightened instantly. What kind of issue? She handed me a thick folder. I opened it slowly. Financial reports, vendor disputes, delayed payment notices, most of them connected to Ramos Contracting Group. I looked up sharply. Where did these come from? One of the lenders flagged inconsistencies. I stared at the documents in disbelief. Some of the numbers looked terrible. Cash flow shortages, debt exposure, delayed contractor payments. I felt sick, not professionally, personally, because behind every document was 30 years of my life. Victoria watched me carefully. I wanted you to see these before the board meeting next week. I swallowed hard. You think Michael's company might collapse? Victoria didn't answer directly. That depends on whether they stabilize quickly. I closed the folder slowly. A long silence filled the office. Then Victoria leaned forward slightly. Heidi, I need to ask you something difficult. I nodded weakly. If the board removes Ramos Contracting from primary consideration, are you prepared to take full operational control of Dayton? The question hit me like a physical force. Because suddenly, this wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't someday. This was now. My company could actually become larger than Michael's, more respected, more trusted. The exact possibility he laughed at years earlier over Sunday dinner. And strangely enough, instead of triumph, I felt grief. I don't want to destroy him, I whispered. Victoria's expression softened slightly. That says more about you than him. I looked down at the folder again, then quietly admitted I still love him sometimes. Victoria nodded. Of course you do. People think love disappears the moment someone hurts you badly enough. That isn't true. Sometimes love remains long after trust dies, long after respect dies, long after the relationship itself becomes unrecognizable. Victoria folded her hands. But Heidi, protecting someone from consequences and loving them are not the same thing. God, that sentence stayed with me, because for 30 years I had confused sacrifice with love, cleaning up Michael's mistakes, absorbing disrespect, making myself smaller to preserve his comfort. I called Walter Brooks immediately after leaving Victoria's office. I need advice. Walter chuckled dryly. Well, that sounds serious. It is. We met at a diner halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati that evening. Walter listened quietly while I explained the situation. When I finished, he leaned back slowly in the booth. You know what your problem is? I smiled faintly. I'm sure you're about to tell me. You still think protecting Michael makes you a good person. I frowned slightly. I don't want revenge. Walter nodded. That's good. I don't want to humiliate him. That's good too. I stared at my coffee cup. Then why do I feel guilty? Walter's voice softened. Because women like you were raised to believe your worth comes from how much pain you can quietly survive. I looked up at him. And because deep down, you still think choosing yourself is selfish. The diner suddenly felt very quiet around us. Walter shook his head slowly. Heidi, let me ask you something. Okay. If Michael were in your position right now, do you think he'd hesitate to choose himself? I already knew the answer. No, not for 1 second. That realization hurt more than I expected, because love becomes heartbreaking when you realize the sacrifice was never mutual. A few days later, Jason showed up at my office unexpectedly again. This time, he looked exhausted, older somehow. He stood awkwardly near the doorway, while my employees pretended not to notice tension filling the room. Can we talk? I nodded and led him into my office. Jason sat down heavily. Dad's in trouble. I stayed quiet. He's not telling people how bad things are. My chest tightened. Jason rubbed his face. Some projects are underwater financially. I already suspected that. But hearing it out loud still hurt. Then Jason looked directly at me. You could help him. There it was. Not, how are you feeling? Not, I'm sorry for how Dad treated you. Just save him again. I folded my hands carefully. Jason, he's still my father, and I'm still your mother. Jason looked down immediately. Guilt flashed briefly across his face. For the first time, I think he finally realized how rarely he defended me. He built everything for us, Jason whispered. I took a slow breath. No, Jason. He looked up. We built everything. Silence. Then I continued softly. Your father had talent, ambition, vision. I won't take that away from him. Jason stayed quiet, but I carried parts of that company too, for decades. He rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. I know you helped. The word helped almost made me laugh again. Such a tiny word for sacrificing your identity. I protected payroll when money disappeared, I said calmly. I fixed contracts, managed schedules, handled clients, solved crises. Jason looked stunned, hearing everything spoken plainly. Because invisible labor only stays invisible when nobody says it out loud. I gave that company thousands of unpaid hours, I continued quietly. And your father spent years pretending my contribution wasn't real. Jason's eyes lowered. For the first time in our lives, my son had no defense ready. Before leaving, he paused at the office door. Do you still love Dad? The question caught me off guard. I thought carefully before answering. I love who I believed he was. Jason swallowed hard, then nodded once before walking away. That night, I stayed alone in the office long after everyone left. The city lights glowed softly beyond the windows, while proposal files covered my desk. Dayton schedules, financial forecasts, contractor oversight plans, my future. And suddenly, I realized something strange. I no longer wanted revenge. Not really. Because revenge still keeps your life emotionally tied to the person who hurt you. What I wanted now was freedom. Freedom from shrinking. Freedom from apologizing for my intelligence. Freedom from needing Michael Ramos to validate my existence. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Victoria stepped into the office holding her coat. "You're still here? So are you." She smiled faintly, then looked around my office carefully. "You built all this from your kitchen table?" I laughed softly. "When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous." "No," Victoria replied gently. "It sounds extraordinary." I looked away because praise still embarrassed me. Then Victoria said something I will never forget. "You know what the board said after your Dayton presentation?" I frowned slightly. "What they said, you were the calmest person in the room." I stared at her. Victoria smiled. Men mistake loudness for leadership all the time. For a second, emotion clogged my throat unexpectedly. Because all my life, Michael's voice filled every room while mine learned to become smaller. And now, the very qualities he mocked in me were becoming the reason powerful people trusted me more than him. The truth finally collapsed on a Wednesday morning. Quietly, without warning, without dignity. I was in my office reviewing contractor schedules for Dayton when my assistant knocked softly on the door. "Heidi." I looked up from my laptop. "There are 2 men here asking for Michael Ramos." My stomach tightened instantly. "Who are they?" "They said they're from the bank." Every nerve in my body went cold. I stood slowly and walked toward the reception area. 2 men in dark suits stood near the front desk, holding leather folders. Their expressions carried that practiced professional politeness people use when delivering terrible news. One introduced himself. "We're trying to reach Mr. Michael Ramos regarding several outstanding financial matters." I swallowed carefully. "This is not Ramos Contracting." "We understand," the older man replied gently. "However, your name appears on several guarantor documents tied to existing commercial debt." There it was again. My name, attached to obligations I barely understood. I felt suddenly dizzy. Emily appeared beside me almost instantly after hearing the conversation from her office. "What kind of debt?" she asked sharply. The banker hesitated professionally. "We really need to speak directly with Mr. Ramos." I nodded weakly. "I understand." After they left, Emily closed the office doors immediately. "Mom." I sat down slowly in the nearest chair because my knees suddenly felt unstable. Emily crouched beside me. "Look at me. I did. You need a lawyer." I stared at the floor silently, because deep down, I already knew she was right. That afternoon, I drove home earlier than usual. The house felt unnaturally quiet. Michael's truck sat in the driveway. When I entered the kitchen, I found him sitting alone at the table, staring at paperwork spread everywhere around him. Loan notices, past due statements, legal correspondence. For the first time in 30 years, Michael Ramos looked defeated. Not angry, not arrogant. Defeated. He looked up slowly when I entered. "They came to your office." Not a question. I nodded. Michael rubbed both hands over his face. I was trying to handle it. "How bad is it?" Silence. Then finally, worse than I thought. I sat across from him carefully. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I noticed something horrifying among the documents. My signature. Again. Repeated over and over. Some real, some clearly not. And suddenly, something inside me hardened permanently. I picked up one of the loan agreements. You forged these. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Heidi, you forged my name. It wasn't like that. My voice rose for the first time in years. Then what exactly was it like? Michael stood abruptly and started pacing. I was trying to keep the company alive. You committed fraud. You don't understand the pressure I was under. I stared at him in disbelief. No, you don't understand what you've done to me. Michael stopped pacing. For one brief second, genuine shame crossed his face. Then immediately came defensiveness again. I built that company for this family. I laughed bitterly. No, Michael. You used this family to protect yourself. That landed hard. His face tightened instantly. I did what I had to do. You used my identity without permission. You benefited from that company too. God, that sentence, even now, even caught, even exposed, somehow he still believed I owed him loyalty. Tears burned behind my eyes, but not from weakness anymore, from grief. Because the man standing in front of me was finally impossible to romanticize. I whispered. How long? Michael looked away. How long have you been signing my name? Silence? Then, quietly, years. The room felt like it tilted. Years. Not one desperate mistake. Not one emergency decision. Years. Every memory suddenly rearranged itself in my mind. Every rushed signature. Every time he dismissed my questions. Every moment he treated me like I wasn't intelligent enough to understand finances. It had never been accidental. Control works best when the other person doubts themselves. I sat there trembling slightly while Michael continued talking. The business had cash flow problems after the recession. I barely heard him anymore. Banks wouldn't approve restructuring without additional guarantees. My voice sounded strangely calm when I finally interrupted. So you stole my name. Michael slammed his hand onto the table suddenly. I kept this family alive. The explosion startled both of us. Then silence filled the kitchen again. Heavy, ugly, final. A soft voice behind us broke the tension. Dad. We turned. Jason stood frozen near the doorway. I hadn't even heard him enter. His eyes moved slowly between us. Then down toward the paperwork, the signatures, the loan notices, the panic on Michael's face. Jason looked confused. What's going on? Michael immediately straightened. Nothing you need to worry about. But for the first time in his life, Jason didn't instantly believe him. He looked at me instead. And maybe it was the tears in my eyes. Or maybe it was years of tiny moments finally connecting inside his mind. What happened? He asked quietly. I couldn't answer. So Michael did. Poorly. There were some financial decisions. Did you forge Mom's signature? The bluntness of the question shattered the room. Michael froze. And that silence told Jason everything. I watched my son's face change in real time. Shock, confusion, disbelief, then devastation. Because when children idolize parents, the collapse of that illusion feels almost physical. Jason stepped backward slightly. You forged Mom's name? Michael's voice turned defensive again. You don't understand business pressure. Jason laughed once, but it sounded broken. No, don't do that. Jason, don't talk to me like I'm stupid. That sentence stunned me almost as much as Michael, because for the first time, Jason sounded like a man seeing his father clearly instead of worshiping him blindly. Michael moved toward him. I was protecting this family. Jason shook his head slowly. You humiliated Mom for years. Michael stiffened. That's not true. Yes, it is. The silence afterward felt enormous. Jason looked at me with tears building in his eyes, and suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. My son wasn't only grieving who his father really was. He was grieving all the times he joined him. Every laugh at my expense. Every dismissal. Every moment he learned masculinity by watching Michael reduce me. Jason whispered, "Oh my God." Then he looked directly at me, and for the first time in my life, my son truly saw me. Not as mom, not as background support, as a person. "I'm sorry," he whispered shakily. That apology almost destroyed me, because it came too late to erase the years, but not too late to matter. Michael looked furious suddenly. "This is unbelievable." Jason turned toward him. "No, Dad. What's unbelievable is that she stayed this long." Michael stared at his son like he'd been slapped, and honestly, maybe he had. Because losing respect from strangers hurts, but losing it from your own child, that kind of truth cuts differently. Jason grabbed his jacket quickly. "I can't do this right now." Then he walked out the front door. Michael started after him instinctively. "Jason," but the door slammed before he reached it. The sound echoed through the house like the ending of something. Michael stood there breathing heavily, then slowly turned toward me. For the first time in 30 years, he looked afraid. Not afraid of losing money. Not afraid of losing projects. Afraid of losing the image of himself that kept his entire life standing. And suddenly, I realized something important. Michael never expected consequences because he never believed the women around him would stop protecting him from them. But I was done protecting him now. Completely. The final Dayton board meeting took place 2 weeks after everything fell apart. By then, the rumors surrounding Ramos Contracting Group had spread across the industry completely. Banks were reviewing financial exposure. Developers were nervous. Subcontractors whispered constantly. And Michael looked like a man trying desperately to hold together a collapsing building with his bare hands. I almost didn't recognize him anymore. Not because he suddenly became weak, because the performance finally stopped. No more loud confidence, no more effortless charm, no more certainty filling every room he entered. Just exhaustion, raw and visible. The morning of the meeting, I stood alone in my office, staring at the city skyline through the glass windows. Columbus looked gray beneath heavy clouds. My reflection in the glass startled me slightly. Tailored cream blazer, hair carefully styled. Calm expression. A woman who looked like she belonged in executive boardrooms. Sometimes I still searched for the invisible housewife inside her. Emily knocked softly before stepping inside. "You ready?" I smiled faintly. "No." Emily walked over, holding 2 coffees. "Well, good thing you've been pretending to be fearless for months." I laughed quietly. "That obvious only to people who love you?" The tenderness in her voice nearly made me emotional. Emily handed me coffee and studied me carefully. "You know something? What you don't shrink anymore." God, that hit me harder than she probably intended, because she was right. Even the way I stood had changed. The way I spoke, the way I occupied space. For decades, I had unconsciously apologized for existing in rooms beside Michael. Now, I walked into those same rooms carrying my own authority. Not loudly, but fully. An hour later, our executive team arrived at the Dayton Conference Center. The building buzzed with nervous energy. Assistants rushing through hallways, developers checking phones constantly, lawyers carrying thick folders. And somewhere inside all that tension sat the future of both my company and Michael's. Victoria Bennett met me near the boardroom entrance. "You look calm," she said. I almost laughed. "I'm having heart palpitations." Victoria smiled slightly. "Good. Means you care." Then her expression softened. "You've already earned your seat at this table, Heidi?" I nodded quietly, but before I could respond, movement down the hallway caught my attention. Michael. He walked toward the conference room, wearing a dark navy suit that suddenly seemed too large on him somehow. Beside him was Jason. That surprised me. Jason hadn't spoken much to either of us since the night everything exploded at the house. But when his eyes met mine, something inside them had changed permanently. No more blind loyalty, no more easy certainty, just sadness. Michael stopped several feet away from me. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then finally, he said quietly, "You look nice." The comment felt strangely heartbreaking, because after everything, some part of us still remembered how to be human with each other. "Thank you," I answered softly. Michael nodded once, then looked around nervously at the growing crowd outside the boardroom. "I heard the banks are pressuring the board." Victoria stepped slightly closer beside me. "They're pressuring for transparency." Michael's jaw tightened immediately. There it was again. That instinctive resistance whenever accountability entered the room. The boardroom doors opened moments later. Everyone filed inside. Massive oak table, floor-to-ceiling windows, rows of executives reviewing files, developers whispering, financial advisors scanning reports. The atmosphere felt less like a business meeting and more like a courtroom. I took my seat across from Michael, and suddenly, I remembered another table years earlier, Sunday dinner. Michael laughing while Jason laughed beside him. "You running a company, that's adorable. Funny how life circles back around sometimes." The meeting began with financial reviews and project risk assessments. Developers spoke first, then legal consultants, then banking representatives. As discussions continued, it became increasingly obvious what was happening. Ramos' contracting group no longer inspired confidence. The financial instability was too serious. The forged signature investigation remained unresolved. And worst of all, Michael's leadership itself had become a liability. For the first time in his career, rooms stopped bending around his personality. Facts had replaced charisma. Numbers had replaced ego. Eventually, the board chairwoman turned toward me. "Ms. Ramos?" I straightened slightly. "We've reviewed your company's operational projections." I nodded carefully. "Your coordination systems significantly outperformed expectations." Across the table, I felt Michael go still. The chairwoman continued. "Several developers specifically noted your leadership during recent project disruptions." My throat tightened unexpectedly, because even now praise still felt unfamiliar. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "The board would like to formally offer Ramos Project Solutions primary operational authority over the Dayton Redevelopment Initiative." Silence. Complete silence. I heard someone inhale sharply somewhere near the back wall. My hands trembled slightly beneath the table. Primary operational authority. Not supporting role, not consulting support. Primary authority. My company had officially become bigger than Michael's, the exact thing he once laughed at. Slowly, I turned toward him. Michael stared at the table motionless. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just hollowed out. And suddenly, to my own surprise, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Because this wasn't just the collapse of his company. It was the collapse of the identity he built his entire life around. The board chairwoman continued speaking about transition structures and contractor opportunities. Then finally, Ramos Contracting may still be considered for subcontracting portions of the project pending financial review. Subcontracting. Michael's company, the company he once believed untouchable, was now asking for partial survival under mine. The irony felt almost unbearable. One executive turned toward me. "Ms. Ramos, if selected as lead operational authority, would you be comfortable overseeing subcontractor compliance standards across all participating firms?" Everyone understood what he was really asking. Would I oversee Michael? The room waited silently. I looked directly at my husband. 30 years together. 30 years of love and humiliation and sacrifice and invisible labor. 30 years of becoming smaller so he could feel larger. Then I answered calmly, "Yes." Michael closed his eyes briefly, but I continued, "Under one condition." The room stayed silent. All participating companies, including my own, will follow identical transparency and financial accountability standards. Several board members nodded approvingly immediately. One even smiled slightly. Because what I offered wasn't revenge, it was fairness. That mattered. Michael looked at me slowly then. Really looked at me. And for the first time in our marriage, I think he fully understood something devastating. I no longer needed his approval to exist. The meeting ended nearly 2 hours later. People stood shaking hands and discussing transition plans, while executives crowded around me, asking questions about operational timelines. Meanwhile, Michael remained seated alone at the far end of the table. Jason walked toward him quietly. Then, after a brief hesitation, he turned and came toward me instead. My breath caught slightly. Jason stopped in front of me, looking overwhelmed. "I was wrong," he whispered. The simplicity of it nearly broke my heart. I should have seen everything sooner. Tears filled my eyes instantly. Jason looked down briefly. "You built more than Dad ever admitted." I reached for his hand, and for the first time in years, my son held on to me like he finally understood who I truly was. Across the room, Michael watched us silently, and suddenly, I realized something strange. The biggest victory of my life wasn't winning Dayton. It wasn't becoming more successful than my husband. It wasn't proving people wrong. The real victory was this. I had finally stopped abandoning myself just to keep someone else comfortable. 6 months after the Dayton meeting, my life barely resembled the one I used to cry over in my kitchen at midnight. Sometimes that still startled me. Not because everything became perfect. It didn't. Healing is not neat. It's messy and exhausting and strangely quiet after years of chaos. But for the first time in my adult life, I woke up each morning without feeling invisible. And that changed everything. Ramos Project Solutions expanded faster than anyone expected after the Dayton contract announcement. Developers who once ignored my emails now requested meetings weeks in advance. Regional firms approached us for partnerships. Industry magazines started calling me one of the most trusted operational consultants in Midwest development. Every time I saw articles like that, part of me still wanted to laugh. Because somewhere deep inside me still lived the woman standing silently at Michael's dinner parties, pretending not to notice being humiliated. But she was no longer in control of my life. The legal investigation into the forged loan documents continued for months. In the end, my attorneys successfully proved I had not knowingly approved several financial guarantees tied to Michael's debt restructuring. That protection mattered enormously. Because for the first time, I chose to protect myself instead of automatically protecting my husband. That decision haunted me at first. I won't lie about that. There were nights I sat alone in my apartment, wondering whether I had become cold, whether standing up for myself somehow made me cruel. Then slowly, I started understanding something important. Women are often taught that self-preservation feels selfish because sacrifice benefits everyone around them. But survival is not selfish. Truth is not cruelty. And boundaries are not betrayal. Michael moved into a smaller townhouse outside Columbus after we separated. The courts forced significant restructuring of Ramos Contracting Group, and eventually Michael lost controlling ownership of the company he spent 30 years building. That part devastated him. I know it did. Sometimes people expect stories like mine to end with hatred. But honestly, I mostly felt sadness. Not because Michael lost power, because he never realized what truly mattered until everything collapsed around him. One rainy afternoon in October, nearly a year after the Dayton board meeting, Michael asked to meet for coffee. I almost declined. Then something inside me whispered, "Go." So I did. He looked older when I walked into the cafe. Not physically only, emotionally. Like life had finally forced him to stop performing. Michael stood awkwardly when he saw me. "You look good," he said quietly. I smiled politely. "So do you." That was a lie, but not a cruel one. We sat near the window while rain streaked softly across the glass. For several minutes, we only talked about practical things. Lawyers, financial settlements, Jason, Emily. Safe subjects. Then, finally, Michael looked down at his coffee cup and said, "I was awful to you." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because I needed them anymore, because I once spent decades starving for them. I stayed quiet. Michael swallowed hard. "You know what the worst part is?" I looked at him carefully. I really thought I was the reason everything succeeded. There it was, the truth. Not just arrogance, belief. Michael genuinely built his identity around being the sole architect of our life together. And the world encouraged that illusion constantly because invisible women rarely receive visible credit. "I needed you," he admitted quietly. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Not because reconciliation was coming. It wasn't. Some things break too deeply, but hearing the truth still mattered. Michael shook his head slowly. "I think part of me knew how much I depended on you." I listened silently, and I think that scared me. That honesty almost hurt more than the cruelty ever did, because suddenly, I could finally see the frightened, insecure man hiding beneath all those years of control. Michael looked at me carefully. "You became everything I laughed at." I smiled faintly. "No." He frowned slightly. "I became everything you refused to see." That silence afterward felt peaceful somehow. Not repaired, but honest. When we left the cafe, Michael hesitated before walking away. Then quietly said, "I hope you know I'm proud of you." 5 years earlier, that sentence would have meant everything to me. Now it simply felt sad that it arrived so late. Emily became my operations director officially the following spring. Watching her thrive beside me healed something inside my heart I didn't even realize was wounded. She often teased me during meetings now. "Mom, you know you intimidate developers these days, right?" I laughed every time she said it, because somewhere deep down, I still felt like the woman nobody took seriously. Jason took longer to rebuild his relationship with me. Guilt does that to people. But eventually, slowly, we found our way back toward each other. One evening, he came by my office after most employees had already left. He stood awkwardly near my desk, holding 2 coffees. "Peace offering," he said. I smiled softly. "I'll accept." Jason sat down across from me looking nervous. Then finally said the thing I think he had rehearsed for weeks. I became too much like Dad. The honesty in his voice broke my heart. "You were taught to. That's not an excuse." "No," I agreed gently. "But it matters." Jason rubbed his hands together anxiously. "I keep thinking about all those times you got dismissed at dinner or interrupted, and I just joined in." I reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. "You were young. I was old enough to know better. Tears filled his eyes suddenly. "I'm really sorry, Mom." And this time, unlike before, I believed him fully. Healing doesn't always arrive dramatically either. Sometimes it sounds like your grown son finally seeing you clearly for the first time. The most meaningful change in my life came quietly one afternoon during a hiring interview. A woman named Denise sat across from me, twisting her purse nervously. She was 61 years old and had spent decades doing administrative support for her husband's plumbing company. As she apologized repeatedly for not having executive experience, something inside me recognized her immediately. Because she was me, the old me, invisible, undervalued, conditioned to doubt herself. I hired her on the spot. Over the next year, I intentionally built programs inside Ramos Project Solutions specifically focused on hiring and mentoring older women overlooked in construction and development industries. Women with experience nobody respected properly. Women who carried businesses quietly from behind the scenes. Women who had spent decades hearing, "You're just helping." No, they were building empires too. They simply weren't allowed to put their names on them. One night, long after everyone left the office, I stood alone in front of the giant windows overlooking downtown Columbus. The city lights glittered beneath the dark sky. Behind me stretched an entire office floor carrying my company's name. My company. Not Michael's. Not anyone else's. Mine. And suddenly, I remembered that woman sitting at her kitchen table years earlier, with trembling hands hovering over an LLC registration form, while her husband laughed upstairs. I wish I could go back and tell her something. Not you'll become richer. Not you'll become successful. Not even you'll prove them wrong. I would simply tell her this. One day, you will stop needing permission to believe you matter. And that freedom will feel bigger than any company you ever build. Ket thuk fan moilam. After spending most of my life trying to make everyone else comfortable, I learned something I wish more women were told when they were young. Sacrifice is not supposed to erase you. Loving your family should never require abandoning yourself completely. For years, I believed being a good wife meant staying quiet, being supportive, forgiving everything, and asking for very little in return. I thought strength looked like endurance. I thought survival meant learning how to shrink without complaining. But eventually, I realized something heartbreaking. The more invisible I became, the more comfortable everyone else grew with my invisibility. And that happens to so many women, especially women over 50. Women who quietly hold families together. Women who organize businesses behind the scenes. Women who carry emotional weight nobody acknowledges because they do it so gracefully, people stop noticing it exists at all. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Do not let years of sacrifice convince you that your dreams expired. They didn't. It is never too late to build something for yourself. It is never too late to speak louder. It is never too late to stop apologizing for your intelligence, your ambition, or your value. And most importantly, do not confuse being needed with being loved. Real love does not require you to disappear. If this story touched your heart in any way, I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever spent years feeling underestimated or invisible in your own life? And where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are right now? Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional stories like this. I read far more comments than you probably realize, especially the honest ones.